The wind in Bitter Creek did not merely blow, it scoured. It came screaming down from the jagged spine of the distant blue mountains, gathering speed across miles of yellow, broken sagebrush, until it hit the town like a physical blow. It was a dry, relentless force that stripped paint from wood and hope from the soul. On this particular afternoon in the autumn of 1878, the wind seemed determined to dismantle the settlement entirely. Dust devils, tall and malevolent, spun down the center of the main street, dancing between the hitching posts and the warped wooden sidewalks that flanked the rows of false front buildings. The town of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, was not a place built for comfort. It was a station of necessity, a collection of gray buildings clinging to the high plains like barnacles on the hull of a ship in rough seas. The sky above was a vast, unforgiving dome of pale steel, pressing down on the inhabitants, reminding them of their own insignificance. Inside the small community church, the air was still but heavy with the scent of old beeswax and dry timber. Clara Vance stood near the altar, her fingers twisting into the rough fabric of her skirt. The dress was not hers. It belonged to the wife of the boarding house owner where Clara had scrubbed floors for the last 3 months to earn her keep. It was a severe garment of charcoal wool, slightly too loose in the shoulders and too tight at the waist, smelling faintly of camphor and someone else's sweat. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood to keep her panic at bay. She was 19 years old, though the shadows under her eyes and the weary set of her mouth made her look older. She had come west on a wagon train that had depleted everything she owned and nearly everything she was. Her parents were buried back in Ohio, and the aunt she was supposed to meet in Cheyenne had died of cholera 2 weeks before Clara arrived. She was alone, penniless, and possessed of a terror she could not articulate, a fear of men that lived in her marrow. The church was not empty. A handful of townsfolk sat in the pews, their presence motivated more by curiosity than celebration. They were hard-faced women in bonnets who whispered behind their hands, and men with leathery skin who watched with guarded, cynical eyes. To them, Clara was a stray, a girl with no people and no dowry, lucky to have found a man willing to take her on. The whispers grew louder as the heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked open. The wind howled briefly, invading the sanctuary before the doors were forced shut again. Silas Thorne walked down the aisle. He was late. The dust of the range coated his long canvas duster, turning it the color of the dry earth outside. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a stiff, heavy grace that spoke of old injuries and endless labor. He removed his hat, revealing hair that was dark but shot through with premature gray at the temples. His face was a map of the frontier, sunburned, lined by squinting against the glare, and marked by a pale, jagged scar that ran from his left cheekbone down into his beard, a souvenir from a war he rarely spoke of. The spurs on his boots clinked with a dull, rhythmic sound that echoed in the silence. Chink, chink, chink. He did not look like a bridegroom. He looked like a man who had ridden hard to conclude a business transaction before the sun went down. He stopped beside Clara, towering over her. She could smell the scent of him, horses, tobacco, leather, and the metallic tang of the wind. She did not look up. She felt the heat radiating from him, a physical weight that made her breath catch in her throat. Reverend Ezekiel Prynne cleared his throat from behind the pulpit. He was a gaunt man with eyes like polished stones, a preacher who believed suffering was the primary language of God. He looked from Silas to Clara with a thinly veiled disapproval. He did not like these arranged marriages, these unions born of desperation and convenience. He preferred the clean lines of righteous courtship, not this bargaining of survival against loneliness. "We are gathered here," the Reverend said, his voice dry as parchment, "to join this man and this woman in the holy estate of matrimony." The ceremony was stripped of all poetry. There were no hymns, no readings of love enduring all things. It was a legal binding, quick and practical. Silas stood rigid, his large hands holding his hat by the brim in front of him. When the time came to speak, his voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse. "I do," Silas said. The Reverend turned his gaze to Clara. "Do you?" Clara Vance, take this man to be your wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Clara felt the eyes of the town on her back. She felt the crushing reality of her situation. If she walked out those doors alone, she starved. It was that simple. There was no romance here, only the brutal arithmetic of the frontier. She looked at the Reverend's shoes, unable to meet his gaze. Her hands shook violently, the tremors traveling up her arms. She felt like a trapped animal, the cage door swinging shut. "I do," she whispered. Her voice was so faint it was nearly lost in the vastness of the room. The ring Silas slid onto her finger was a thick band of gold, heavy and warm from his pocket. It felt foreign on her hand, a shackle disguised as jewelry. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said, snapping his Bible shut with a sound of finality. There was no kiss. Silas merely nodded to the preacher, then turned to look at Clara. For the first time, their eyes met. His were dark, unreadable, shadowed by the brim of his hat, which he now replaced. He did not smile. He looked at her with a strange intensity, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to find so difficult. The wagon was waiting outside. It was a sturdy, ugly thing, built for hauling feed and timber, not brides. The wind tore at Clara's skirts as she stepped out of the church, blinding her with grit. Silas offered her a hand to help her up to the high seat. His palm was calloused, rough like sandstone, and when his fingers closed around hers, she flinched. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, his grip loosening instantly, before he helped her up with a distant, professional courtesy. They rode out of town without fanfare. The buildings of Bitter Creek fell away, replaced by the crushing immensity of the open range. The road to the Thorn Ranch was little more than 2 ruts worn into the hardpan, winding through gullies and over rise after rise of yellow grass that shivered under the assault of the gale. The silence between them was louder than the rattle of the harness or the creaking of the wheels. Silas focused on the team of horses, his gloved hands holding the reins with an easy competence. Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the horizon. The landscape was terrifyingly beautiful. To the west, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the clouds in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The vastness of it made Clara feel exposed. In Ohio, there were trees, fences, neighbors. Here, there was only distance. A wolf, gray and ragged, watched them from a ridge 100 yards away before turning and vanishing into the brush. "It is a fair piece yet," Silas said suddenly, his voice startling her. "About 2 hours." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He did not try to make conversation again. He seemed content with the silence, or perhaps he was just as unsure of what to say to the stranger sitting beside him. He was 42 years old, a widower who had buried a wife and a stillborn son 10 years ago. He had lived alone since then, turning his heart into something as hard and unyielding as the land he worked. He needed a wife because the ranch needed a mistress, because a man could not run 3,000 head of cattle and keep a house, and because he wanted an heir to leave it all to. It was a practical decision. But looking at the girl beside him, she looked like a girl, terrified and frail. He felt a seed of doubt take root in his gut. She looked breakable. And the Wyoming territory broke everything eventually. Darkness had fully descended by the time they reached the ranch. The house sat in a shallow valley, sheltered by a grove of cottonwood trees that had been twisted by the wind into gnarled shapes. It was a sturdy structure of weather-beaten logs, gray as bone, with a stone chimney rising from the center. A lean-to barn stood off to one side, and a corral held a few dozing horses. A windmill, its blades turning lazily in the cooling night air, groaned with a rhythmic metal screech, creak, screech, creak, screech. Everything about the place spoke of years of solitary, grinding labor. There were no flower beds, no painted shutters. It was a fortress for survival. Silas halted the team and set the brake. "You go on inside," he said. "The door is unlocked. I have to see to the horses." Clara climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride. She walked to the heavy front door and pushed it open. The interior was warm. retaining the heat of the day. A single kerosene lamp burned low on a table, evidently left by the ranch hand who looked after things. Clara looked around. The main room was clean, but sparse. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth, and a cast-iron stove that dominated the kitchen area. There were no curtains on the windows, only wooden shutters. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the unique, dusty smell of a bachelor's existence. She stood in the center of the room, still wearing her bonnet, feeling like an intruder. This was his life. She was just a new piece of furniture he had acquired. When Silas came in 20 minutes later, he carried the cold on his coat. He hung his hat on a peg by the door and washed his hands in a basin, the water splashing loudly in the quiet room. "I reckon you are hungry," he said, drying his hands on a rough towel. "I can cook," Clara said quickly. Her voice sounded thin. "I know how to cook. Sit," Silas commanded, though not unkindly. "You have had a long day. I have got a stew on the back of the stove." The first supper was an agony of awkwardness. They sat opposite each other at the small table. The stew was thick with beef and potatoes, seasoned only with salt. Clara ate because she knew she must, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Every clink of her spoon against the tin plate sounded like a gunshot. Silas ate with the efficiency of a man used to eating alone. He kept his eyes on his plate, but every now and then, Clara felt his gaze flick up to her, assessing, wondering. "The wind is picking up," he said at last. "Yes," Clara replied. "It is very loud. It gets louder in winter." "You get used to it. I suppose I will." The conversation died there, strangled by the weight of what was coming. The wedding night, the obligation, the duty she had been raised to understand was the price of a woman's security. When the meal was finished, Silas cleared the plates. He moved with a heavy deliberation. He took the lamp from the table and looked at her. "The bedroom is through here," he said. Clara stood up. Her legs felt weak. She followed him into the small room off the main cabin. It was dominated by a large iron bed covered in a heavy quilt. A washstand stood in the corner. Silas set the lamp on a crate beside the bed. The golden light threw long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He turned to her. The small space seemed instantly crowded by his size. He looked at her borrowed gray dress, at the high collar that buttoned to her chin. "I will turn my back," he said quietly. "So you can prepare." He faced the wall, his shoulders hunched slightly. Clara's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her bodice. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stripped down to her shift, the air of the room cool against her skin, goosebumps rising on her arms. She climbed into the bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin, her body rigid, her eyes squeezed shut. "I am ready," she whispered. Silas turned. He had removed his coat and his boots, but he was still dressed in his trousers and shirt. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into a darkness that was not quite total. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the shutters, painting stripes of silver across the floor. The mattress dipped under his weight as he sat on the edge of the bed. Clara stopped breathing. She felt the warmth of him, the sheer mass of him. He shifted, swinging his legs up, and lay down beside her. For a long time, he did not move. Then she felt his hand, large and heavy, rest tentatively on her shoulder. It was meant to be a caress. She knew. He was trying to be a husband. He was trying to claim what was rightfully his by law and custom. But at his touch, the memory seized her. It was not a specific image, but a sensation. The smell of stale whiskey. The feeling of being trapped in a corner. Rough hands groping, a voice slurring obscenities. The trauma of the journey west. The man on the wagon train who had cornered her. The feeling of absolute powerlessness. It all came rushing back in a tidal wave of panic. Clara flinched violently, her body curling in on itself. Her knees came up to her chest. She couldn't help it. Her muscles locked tight, a shield of bone and tension. Silas shifted closer, his hand moving to her waist, his touch firm. "Clara," he said, his voice low and rough. There is no need to be afraid. But the fear was a living thing. As he leaned over her, blocking out the faint light, She felt the panic crest. It was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in her chest and belly, born of pure terror. She was not just shy, she was paralyzed. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the cold log wall, pulling the quilt tighter. "It hurts," she gasped, the words tearing out of her throat. Silas froze. He hovered over her, his silhouette dark and imposing. He had not done anything yet, barely touched her, but she was shaking so hard the bed frame rattled. "I am sorry," she whispered, the tears finally spilling over. Hot and humiliating. "It hurts. I am sorry. Maybe tonight, or another night. I cannot. Please." Her voice broke on the last word. "A plea for mercy." Silas stayed there for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity. He could feel her terror radiating off her like heat from a stove. He was a man with needs, a man who had waited years for the warmth of a woman, who had paid for the license and the ring and the ceremony. He had a right. The world said he had a right. But the sound of her weeping, that broken, terrified sound, cut through his desire like a knife. He felt a sudden, crushing wave of shame. He felt old. He felt like a monster who had frightened a child. He pulled back. The mattress groaned as he shifted his weight away from her. He sat on the edge of the bed again, his back to her, his head hanging low in his hands. Silas stared into the darkness. He felt the sting of rejection burn in his chest, a heavy, dull ache. Was he that repulsive? Was he so scarred and hardened that a woman could not bear his touch? Or was she broken in a way he could not see? He listened to her muffled sobs, the sound of her trying to stifle her crying in the pillow. He looked at his hands in the dark. He could force her. The law would be on his side. The town would expect it. But Silas Thorne was a hard man, not a cruel one. He stood up, the floorboards creaking. Clara flinched again, expecting anger, expecting a blow. "Sleep," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, hiding the turmoil inside. He did not leave the room. He did not go to the barn. He lay back down on top of the quilt, fully clothed, turning his back to her. He lay on the very edge of the mattress, leaving a canyon of cold space between them. He stared at the moonlight on the wall. He listened to the wind battering the house, trying to find a way in. He thought of the cattle he had to check in the morning, the fence line that was down in the north pasture. He thought of the air he wanted, the son he had hoped to teach to ride. That dream seemed very far away tonight, beside him. Clara cried herself into an exhausted sleep, her body still curled in a tight knot of defense. Silas lay awake for hours, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, feeling the loneliness of the high plains settle into the room with them, heavier than before. The next morning, the sun rose cold and bright, revealing the stark reality of the day. Silas was gone before Clara woke. She found the coffee pot warm on the stove and a note scrawled on a scrap of brown paper. Back at noon. She moved through the morning in a daze. She washed her face in the basin, the water shocking her awake. She stripped the bed. The sheets were unsoiled. The marriage was a lie. Outside, the ranch came to life. Jeb, the ranch hand, a wiry man with missing teeth and eyes that missed nothing, walked past the bedroom window. He had come to the house to fetch a tool from the porch. He paused, glancing through the open shutter. He saw the bed. He saw the pillow where Silas had clearly not slept, the lack of disarray that spoke of a wedding night's passion. He chewed his tobacco and spat a stream of brown juice into the dust. He had seen Silas ride out before dawn, dark-faced and silent as a tomb. Jeb grinned to himself. It was a story, and in a town like Bitter Creek, a story was currency. By the time Jeb rode into town later that morning for supplies, the story was burning a hole in his pocket. He told the smithy told the grocer's wife told Mrs. Gable at the dry goods store. By noon, the whisper had circled the town. She would not let him touch her. He slept in his clothes. Maybe she is ruined. Maybe she is sick. The churchwomen, gathering for their sewing circle, nodded their heads with grim satisfaction. They knew it. A girl from nowhere, with no family and a dress that didn't fit. A bride who could not fulfill her duties on her wedding night was unnatural. She was cold. She was strange. The wind picked up again, carrying the dust and the gossip through the cracks in the walls, swirling around the isolated ranch house where Clara Vance stood at the window, watching the empty road, unaware that the town she feared had already decided who she was. Time lost its shape in the high country, dissolving into a relentless cycle of sun and shadow, wind and dust. The days did not pass. They accumulated, layering onto Clara's skin like the grit that found its way through the tightest window seams. The routine was a hard master. It began before the sun crested the eastern ridges, in the blue-gray stillness of the pre-dawn. Clara learned to wake to the sound of Silas's boots hitting the floorboards, a heavy, rhythmic thud that signaled the start of the labor. The mornings were brutally cold, the kind of chill that settled in the bones and refused to leave until noon. She would shiver into her dress, her fingers clumsy with the buttons, listening to the clatter of the stove lid in the other room as Silas stoked the embers from the night before. Cooking was her first battleground. The cast-iron stove was a temperamental beast, prone to belching thick, acrid smoke into the kitchen if the flue was not set just so. Clara had burned her hands 3 times in the first week, leaving angry red welts across her knuckles. She learned to mix the biscuit dough by lamplight, her wrists aching from the kneading, praying the oven was hot enough to rise the bread but not so hot it would burn the bottoms black. Breakfast was a silent affair, fueled by strong coffee and salt pork. Silas ate with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything else, his eyes often fixed on the window and the brightening sky. He was thinking of calves, of water tables, of wolves. Clara watched him over the rim of her tin cup, trying to read the map of his face, but he remained a country she did not know how to navigate. After he rode out, the silence of the house was absolute. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, waiting thing. Clara's days became a war against the elements. Hauling water from the well was a task that left her gasping, her shoulders screaming in protest. The pump was old and reluctant, shrieking with every stroke, yielding the water only after a fight. She carried the heavy wooden buckets back to the house, the water sloshing over the rims to soak the hem of her skirt, turning the fabric heavy and freezing against her ankles. Laundry was worse. Standing in the yard with the galvanized tub, her hands raw and red from the lye soap, she fought the wind for every shirt and sheet she pinned to the line. The gale that swept down from the mountains snatched at the wet fabric, snapping it like a whip. One afternoon, a sheet tore loose and danced away across the sagebrush, forcing her to chase it for 1/4 of a mile, stumbling over gopher holes and rocks, until she caught it, dusted with brown earth and defeated. She stood there for a moment, clutching the dirty sheet, and looked at the world she now inhabited. It was a landscape of violent beauty and terrified scale. The earth was cracked and dry, a patchwork of yellow grass and gray sage that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. To the north, the buttes rose like ruined cathedrals, their flat tops brooding under the vast sky. To the south lay the river, a wide, winding scar of brown water that looked lazy now but, as Silas had warned her, could rise 20 feet in a spring flood and take everything in its path. Storms did not approach here. They ambushed. Clara watched more than once as the blue sky was suddenly swallowed by a bruising wall of purple clouds. Lightning would fork down, silent at first, then followed by thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. Rain would fall in sheets, turning the dust to slick, impassable mud in minutes, only to vanish an hour later, leaving the earth steaming and the air smelling of ozone and wet sage. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. It demanded strength, and Clara terrified herself with the thought that she had none to give. Yet, she tried. She was determined to carve a space for herself in this hardness. She found a stack of old feed sacks in the barn, the fabric coarse and stamped with the logo of a milling company in Omaha. She washed them until her knuckles bled, bleaching out the ink as best she could, and stitched them into curtains for the small windows. They were rough and simple, but when she hung them, they softened the light that fell into the room, filtering the harsh glare into something almost gentle. She mended Silas's shirts, her needle flashing in the lamplight, closing tears made by barbed wire and brush. She darned his socks, weaving the wool over the holes worn by his boots. It was an act of service, a way to pay for her keep, but also a strange intimacy, handling the clothes that held the shape and scent of him. She tried to start a garden in a patch of ground near the kitchen door. The soil was like concrete, resisting the spade. She spent hours on her knees, hacking at the earth, pulling up rocks the size of fists. She planted seeds she had brought in her pocket from Ohio, turnips, carrots, a few hardy beans. The wind tried to scour them away, and the sun tried to burn them, but she carried water to them bucket by bucket, sheltering the green shoots with her own body when the dust devils spun too close. Her hands became rough, the nails broken, the skin stained with the soil of the territory. But when the first bean vine curled around the stake she had driven into the ground, she felt a fierce, quiet pride. Silas noticed. He did not say much, but she saw his eyes linger on the curtains. She saw him run his thumb over the neat stitching on his sleeve. Their conversations began to change, shifting imperceptibly from the terse commands of survival to something resembling exchange. "The coffee is good this morning," he said one day, pausing on the porch as he pulled on his gloves. "I put a crushed eggshell in the grounds," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "My mother said it takes the bitterness out. It works," he said. He looked at her, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners against the morning sun. "It is a sight better than the tar I was brewing." It was a small thing, a tiny bridge built over the chasm between them. Another morning, a red hen, one of the few layers they had, managed to flutter over the fence of the coop. Clara, panicked that a coyote would snatch it, gathered her skirts and gave chase. The hen was fast and foolish, darting in zigzags. Clara lunged, missed, and stumbled, her skirt catching on a low bush. She sat down hard in the dust, the hen clucking triumphantly from the roof of the barn. She expected Silas to be annoyed at her clumsiness. Instead, when she looked up, he was leaning against the fence post, his shoulders shaking. He was laughing. It was a rusty, low sound, like gravel shifting in a stream bed. But it was laughter. "She is faster than she looks," he called out. Clara felt a flush rise in her cheeks, but then a giggle bubbled up in her own throat. It was the absurdity of it, the grand, terrifying frontier, and her sitting in the dirt defeated by a chicken. "I will get her when she comes down for corn," Clara said, brushing the dust from her dress. "You do that," Silas said, and the smile lingered on his face for a long moment, softening the hard lines of his jaw. But the softness of the day always yielded to the tension of the night. The bedroom remained a place of silent battle. Silas was patient. He was a man who understood the long game of breaking horses and waiting for rain. He did not force, he did not demand, but the weight of his expectation hung in the air, heavier than the quilt. He would blow out the lamp, and the darkness would close in. He would reach for her, his movements slower now, more careful. He touched her as if she were made of spun glass that might shatter under his calloused fingertips. Clara would lie rigid, her eyes wide open in the dark. She wanted to yield. She wanted to be the wife he needed, the wife who could give him the son he dreamed of. She told herself to relax, to breathe, to let him in. But the moment his hand moved past her waist, the moment the heavy warmth of his body pressed against hers, the trap snapped shut. Her body remembered what her mind tried to suppress. It remembered the grip of hands that did not ask. It remembered the smell of sour breath and the feeling of being small and powerless. The panic was instantaneous and overriding. Her muscles locked, her breath hitched in short, terrified gasps. Silas would freeze, his hand hovering. "It hurts," she would whisper, the words a mantra of failure. "I'm sorry, I cannot, maybe, tonight we can try again, later." The lie tasted like copper in her mouth. She knew there would be no later. Silas would pull back, rolling to his side of the bed, in the silence. She could hear the grinding of his jaw, the slow, controlled intake of his breath. She felt his frustration radiating across the mattress, a heat that scorched her with guilt. Silas lay there, staring at the ceiling he could not see, Anger coiled in his gut, hot and tight. He was angry at the situation, angry at the waste of it, angry at the loneliness that seemed to have doubled since she arrived. He looked at the shape of her under the quilt, so small, so terrified. Why did he marry her? He asked himself this in the deep watches of the night. He wanted a partner. He wanted life in the house. He wanted a son to leave this land to, so that all his sweat and blood would mean something. And then, unbidden, the memory of Martha would rise up, his first wife. She had been laughter and softness, a woman who met him with open arms. He remembered the night she died, the blood, the silence of the cradle. He remembered the vow he had made to never let a woman suffer for him again. And here he was, terrifying this girl, making her weep in the dark. He felt unfaithful, not just to Martha's memory, but to his own idea of himself as a decent man. He wanted Clara. He felt the pull of desire, a simple human need for connection and release. But her fear made his desire feel like a weapon. He realized, with a sinking heart, that he did not know her. He knew her cooking. He knew her way with a needle. But he did not know the source of the wound that bled every time he touched her. It was deep. He knew that. It was not just shyness. It was a scar on her soul, as real as the one on his face. Town Day was a reprieve and a torture. 2 weeks later, they rode into Bitter Creek for supplies. The wind was manageable, a steady breeze rather than a gale. Clara sat high on the wagon seat, wearing her best bonnet, trying to look like the respectable wife of a substantial rancher. Silas left her at the dry goods store with a list while he went to the blacksmith. The store was cool and smelled of pickle brine and calico. Clara moved through the aisles, selecting flour and sugar, feeling the eyes of the other women on her. They stood in a cluster near the fabric bolts. Mrs. Higgins, the mayor's wife, and Mrs. Gable, a sharp-nosed woman who held the unofficial title of town chronicler. They lowered their voices when Clara approached, but not enough. The whispers were meant to be heard. They were little darts, dipped in poison. I heard the bed linens are never rumpled. Mrs. Gable murmured, her eyes sliding over Clara's figure. Unnatural, Mrs. Higgins agreed. A man like Silas Thorne has needs. If she is not meeting them, she must be broken, or she was loose back east. Mrs. Gable whispered, a malicious glint in her eye. Used up. That is why she came out here, pretending to be pure, but too terrified to let a husband see the truth. Or just frigid. Some women are like that. Cold as a creek in January. The words hit Clara like physical blows. Loose, used up, frigid. The shame burned her face, hot and sudden. Was that what they thought? Was that what Silas thought? She dropped a spool of thread. It rolled across the floor, coming to rest at Mrs. Gable's feet. The woman looked down at it, then at Clara, and offered a tight, pitying smile that did not reach her eyes. You look pale. Dear Mrs. Gable said. Marriage not agreeing with you? Clara snatched up the thread, her hands shaking. I am fine, she said, her voice trembling. She fled the store, leaving half the list unbought. She felt dirty. She felt exposed. The town, with its wooden sidewalks and church steeple, felt like a courtroom where she had already been found guilty. Silas found her sitting in the wagon, her hands clenched in her lap, her face white. Are you ill? He asked, climbing up beside her. I need to see the doctor, she said. The decision had come to her in a flash of desperation. If she was broken, maybe she could be fixed. If there was something wrong with her body, maybe medicine could solve what her will could not. Silas frowned, but turned the horses toward the small clapboard house that served as doctor. Albright Surgery. Doctor. Albright was a man who had seen too much of the frontier's cruelty and had let it harden him into indifference. He was brisk, smelling of rubbing alcohol and stale tobacco. He examined Clara in a cold, sterile room, his hands impersonal and rough. He asked questions that made her want to disappear, about her cycles, about her pain, about the mechanics of the act she could not perform. He finished and wiped his hands on a rag. There is nothing wrong with you physically. Mrs. Thorne. he said, his voice bored. You are tight. Yes, nervous, high-strung. He scribbled something on a piece of paper. Some women make a mountain out of a molehill, he said, not looking at her. You just need to relax. Drink some sherry before bed. And tell your husband he does not need to handle you with kid gloves. Sometimes, a woman just needs to be pushed through the difficulty. Once the deed is done, the hysteria usually settles down. He handed her the paper. It was a bill and a note for Silas. Clara took it, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She was a mechanism to him, a lock that just needed to be forced, pushed through it, as if her terror was a stubborn door and not the screaming of her soul. She walked out to the wagon. Silas was waiting, leaning against the wheel, rolling a cigarette. He looked at her face, saw the devastation there, and tossed the unlit cigarette into the dust. What did he say? Silas asked. Clara climbed onto the seat, staring straight ahead. She handed him the folded note. Silas opened it. He read the doctor's scrawl. Patient is healthy but hysterical. Recommend firm approach. Do not indulge the nerves. Proceed with marital rights. Silas read it twice. His face went very still. The vein in his temple throbbed once. He looked at the doctor's office, then at Clara. He saw the way she was hunching her shoulders, as if expecting a blow. He saw the total, crushing humiliation in her posture. Silas Thorne hated many things. He hated drought. He hated wolves. But mostly, he hated being told what to do with what was his. And he hated, with a sudden, ferocious intensity, the idea of another man discussing his wife's body as if it were a lame horse. He crumbled the paper in his massive fist. He did not say a word. He walked to the side of the wagon, struck a match on the wheel rim, and set the paper on fire. He held it until the flames licked his thumb, then dropped the ash into the dirt and ground it under his heel. Let us go home, he said. The ride back was silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was charged, electric. Clara waited for him to speak, to tell her that the doctor was right, that he would stop indulging her. They reached the ranch at dusk. The wind was howling again, a lonely, battered sound. They went inside. Clara moved to the stove automatically, but her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the lid lifter. It clattered loudly on the floor. She froze. Then, the dam broke. She turned to him, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized were falling. He made me feel so small. She choked out. The words tumbled over each other. He looked at me like I was a thing, like I was broken equipment. He said you should just force me, that I was just being silly. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. I'm afraid. Silas, I am so afraid. Not of you. I know you are a good man. But I am afraid of being used. I am afraid that if I let you, if I let anyone, I will disappear. I will just be a body again, like before. She clamped her hand over her mouth, realizing she had said too much. Like before. Silas stood by the table. He had removed his coat. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripped of his own frustration, seeing only the raw, bleeding panic of a trapped creature. He crossed the room slowly. He did not reach for her. He stopped 3 feet away, giving her space. Clara, he said. His voice was low, deeper than the earth beneath the house. I burned his note, Silas said. Clara looked up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. I do not take orders from doctor. All right, he said, and I do not take what is not given freely. He took a step closer, watching her eyes. When she did not flinch, he took another. I married a wife, Silas said. I did not buy a broodmare. If that doctor thinks I am the kind of man who would hurt you to get what I want, then he does not know me. And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like I was that man. He hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. I will not cast you off. Clara, even if this is all we ever are, even if we never have a son, even if the town talks until their tongues rot, you are my wife. You have a home here. You are safe here. The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. He was offering her a life without conditions. He was telling her that her worth was not tied to her utility. Clara let out a sob that was half a laugh. The tension that had held her spine rigid for weeks suddenly snapped. She slumped, and he caught her. He did not pull her against his hips. He did not try to kiss her. He simply wrapped his arms around her shoulders and held her up. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, smelling the tobacco and the horses and the man. He felt solid. He felt like a wall that the wind could not knock down. That night, the ritual changed. Silas blew out the lamp. He lay down on the bed, but instead of turning his back, he lay on his back, staring up. Clara lay beside him. The space between them was still there, but it was no longer a canyon. It was a bridgeable distance. She felt his hand on the quilt, resting between them. Slowly, tentatively, she moved her own hand. Her fingers brushed his knuckles. He did not grab her. He turned his hand over, palm up, an offering. She slid her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing her small hand in his warmth. It was a grip of protection, not possession. The wind howled outside, battering the shutters, screaming across the miles of empty, dangerous dark. But inside, under the heavy quilt, Clara felt a strange, new sensation. The fear was still there, a shadow in the corner, but it was not ruling her. She closed her eyes. For the first time since she had left Ohio, since she had stood in that church, since she had learned what men could do, she did not flinch at the darkness. "Good night, Silas," she whispered. "Good night, Clara," he replied. She fell asleep with her hand in his, anchored to the earth, while the storm raged impotently against the walls of their home. The spring of 1879 did not bring relief. It brought a scorching, premature heat that sucked the moisture from the earth before the grass could truly green. The creek, usually rushing with snowmelt by May, was reduced to a sluggish, muddy ribbon threading through the rocks. The sound of the wind changed. It no longer whistled. It hissed, dragging sand across the dry sagebrush and piling it in drifts against the fence posts. The tension in the valley was as palpable as the heat. At the general store in Bitter Creek, men spoke in low, clipped tones about water rights and herd reduction. Several smaller homesteaders had already packed their wagons and headed for Oregon, defeated by the unforgiving sky. But where others saw ruin, Hiram Sterling saw opportunity. Hiram Sterling was a man of silk vests and polished boots, an anomaly in a town of denim and dust. He owned the bank, the largest hotel, and the Double Bar S Ranch, which sprawled across the prime grazing land to the east. He was not a man who shouted. He was a man who whispered, and his whispers moved property lines. On a Tuesday afternoon, Sterling sat in his office at the bank, a glass of imported sherry catching the light on his mahogany desk. Before him lay a stack of deeds, the corners worn from handling. He paused at the document for the Thorn Ranch. It was a good piece of land, possessing the only year-round spring in the northern sector, water that Sterling's own thirsty herds would soon need. Sterling adjusted his spectacles. He knew the terms of the loan Silas Thorne's father had taken out 20 years ago, a loan that had been refinanced and restructured but never fully cleared. There was a clause, written in the dense, spider-web script of a Cheyenne lawyer long dead. In the event of the holder's death without legitimate bodily issue to inherit, the title shall revert to the lender to satisfy outstanding obligations. Sterling smiled, a thin tightening of his lips. He had heard the rumors. The town was small, and Mrs. Gable's tongue was long. The Thorne marriage was a sham. A month had passed, and the girl was still as jumpy as a spooked colt. No heir, no consummation. In the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the eyes of the church, a marriage unconsummated was a marriage that did not exist. He closed the ledger. It was only a matter of time, but the Wyoming Territory was not done with them yet. 2 days later, the heat broke, but not with rain. It broke with a violence that shook the ground. The sky turned a bruised, sickly green in the northwest. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in the span of an hour. It was a late spring blizzard. The kind the old-timers feared more than the deep winter snows because the cattle, having shed their winter coats, were vulnerable. Silas saw it coming from the north pasture. He rode hard for the house, shouting for Jeb and the two other hands. "Get the calves in!" Silas roared over the rising wind. "Get them to the lee of the barn!" Clara was in the kitchen when the first hailstone hit the roof. It sounded like a hammer strike. Within seconds, the noise was deafening, a cacophony of ice bombarding the shingles. She looked out the window and saw a world erased by white. She saw Silas through the swirling snow, struggling to turn a group of confused, terrified heifers toward the corral. His horse was rearing, fighting the wind. Jeb was nowhere to be seen, likely cut off in the lower pasture. Clara did not think. She grabbed her heavy wool shawl, threw it over her head, and pushed open the door. The wind nearly tore it from her hinges. Ideally, she should have stayed inside, safe by the stove, but she saw a calf, separated from its mother, bleeding and stumbling toward the creek bed where the drifts would bury it in minutes. Clara ran. The cold was a shock, stealing the breath from her lungs. The hail stung her face like buckshot. She reached the calf, grabbing it by its flank, trying to shove it toward the barn. The animal was heavy and panicked, kicking out. "Ha!" she screamed, her voice lost in the gale. "Go!" Suddenly, the ground shook. A dozen steers, blinded by the snow and driven mad by the hail, stampeded around the corner of the corral. They were headed straight for her. Clara froze. The massive dark shapes loomed out of the whiteout, horns lowered, a wall of muscle and bone moving with unstoppable force. She squeezed her eyes shut, curling her body over the calf, waiting for the impact. Then, a force slammed into her from the side. It was not a steer. It was a man. Silas had thrown himself from his saddle. He hit her at a run, tackling her into the mud and snow, rolling them both under the bottom rail of the corral fence just as the herd thundered past. The hooves smashed into the mud inches from their heads, spraying them with freezing slush. They lay there for a moment, tangled together in the muck, panting. The roar of the cattle faded toward the creek. Silas scrambled up, dragging Clara with him. He shook her, his grip bruising her arms. His face was pale beneath the sunburn and the dirt, his eyes wild. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You could have been killed. Do you have a death wish? Woman?" Clara trembled, her teeth chattering violently. I saw the calf." "Damn the calf!" Silas roared. He was shaking, his entire large frame vibrating with adrenaline and terror. "I do not care about the calf. I care about you." He stopped, realizing he was screaming at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of the storm, but fear of him. The anger drained out of him instantly, leaving him weak. He pulled her against his chest, crushing her to him. His arms went around her, shielding her from the wind, his hand pressing her head into his coat. "I am sorry," he gasped into her hair. "I am sorry. I saw them coming. I thought you were gone." Clara stood frozen in his embrace, the hail turning to snow around them. She felt the erratic, thundering beat of his heart against her cheek. He was terrified. He was not angry about the livestock. He was terrified of losing her. "Come inside," he said roughly, "before we both freeze." That evening, the house was a fortress against the storm. The fire in the hearth roared, casting a golden glow over the room that defied the howling white death outside. They had saved most of the herd, though they had lost 3 calves to the cold. They sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets. Clara's hair was drying in damp tendrils around her face. Her skin tingled from the exposure. She looked at Silas. He was staring into the flames, a mug of whiskey in his hand. He looked exhausted, the lines of his face etched deep by the day's fear. Clara felt a surge of emotion that was new to her. It was a fierce, protective warmth. He had thrown himself under a stampede for her. He had chosen her life over his safety, over his cattle. She stood up and walked to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Silas?" she said softly. He looked up, covering her hand with his. "You should sleep, Clara. It has been a hard day." She did not move. The gratitude was swelling in her chest, mixing with a strange, tentative desire. She wanted to comfort him. She wanted to prove to him that she was worth the risk he had taken. She wanted to be the wife he deserved. "Come to bed," she whispered. Silas went still. He looked at her, searching her face for the familiar fear. It was there, lingering in the corners of her eyes. But there was something else too, determination. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "I want to try," she said. "I want to be close to you." They went into the bedroom. The air was cold, but the bed was piled high with quilts. When they lay down, the storm seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world, creating a pocket of silence where only they existed. Silas was gentle. He moved with agonizing slowness, his hands warm and rough, tracing the line of her jaw, her shoulder. He kissed her, soft, questioning brushes of his lips. Clara focused on his heartbeat. "He saved me. He is safe." She tried to let her body soften. She tried to open the door she had kept bolted for so long. She felt a flicker of warmth in her belly, a response to his closeness. But as his hand moved lower, as the reality of the act pressed in, the old panic rose up like a snake striking. Her muscles seized. The memory of being pinned, of being helpless, flooded her mind, drowning out the present. She gasped, her body going rigid. Her hands flew up to push at his chest, an automatic defense. "It hurts," she whispered, the words choked with tears. "Silas, I cannot. It hurts." Silas stopped instantly. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy. He did not pull away in anger, but she could feel the defeat in his body. It was a heavy, sinking weight. Clara began to cry. The sobs started deep in her chest and shook her whole frame. "I am sorry," she wept. "I am so sorry. I am useless. You should just let me go." Silas pulled back to look at her, his brows knitting together. "What? You should let me go," she sobbed. "Send me away. Find a woman who is not broken. You deserve a real wife. You deserve sons. I am just a burden. I am ruining your life." The words poured out of her, the dark thoughts she had nursed for weeks. She waited for him to agree. She waited for him to say that yes, he had made a bad bargain. Silas sat up. He looked down at her, his face stern in the shadows. "Is that what you think?" he asked. "That I traded for you like a horse? That I can just trade you in when you come up lame?" He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "I did not choose a body. Clara, I chose you. I chose the woman who plants a garden in the dust. I chose the woman who ran into a blizzard to save a calf." He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I am not going anywhere," he said firmly, "and neither are you. We will figure this out, if it takes a year, or 10 years, or forever. I am not trading you for anyone." Clara stared at him, stunned. He was offering her a loyalty she did not think she possessed a right to. She curled into him, burying her face in his chest, and he held her while the storm blew itself out, his patience a solid rock in the swirling chaos of her inadequacy. The snow melted within 2 days, leaving the ranch a sea of mud, and then the mud dried, and the dust returned. A week later, a buggy with yellow-spoked wheels came up the track. It was driven by a man in a bowler hat, but the passenger was Hiram Sterling. Silas was repairing the corral fence where the stampede had loosened the rails. He straightened as the buggy pulled up, his hammer hanging loosely in his hand. Clara came out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. Sterling stepped down, avoiding the horse manure with practiced ease. He tipped his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Thorne," he said smoothly. "A pleasure. And Silas, good to see you weathering the storm. What do you want, Hiram?" Silas asked. He did not invite the man to the porch. Sterling smiled, a gesture that showed teeth but no warmth. "Just a neighborly call. I heard you took some losses in the blow." "A few head," Silas said. "We will recover. I am sure you will." Sterling walked to the fence, running a gloved hand over the wood. Although, with the drought, well, margins are tight for everyone. He turned his gaze to Clara. She stood by the post, looking thin in her calico dress. The stress of the last few months had stripped the weight from her. Her collarbones were sharp ridges against her skin. "You are looking..." Delicate. Mrs. Thorn, Sterling said. The frontier is hard on a woman's constitution, particularly one accustomed to softer climates. I am stronger than I look. Mr. Sterling, Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly. Indeed. Sterling's eyes dropped to her waist, then back to her face. No. Happy news yet. Then, no little ones to fill up that big house? Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Sterling and Clara. My wife's health is none of your concern. Hiram, state your business or get off my land. Sterling held up his hands in mock surrender. Touchy. Silas, I merely meant to say that if the burden of this place becomes too much, with no heir to work it in the future, the bank is always willing to make a generous offer. It might be better to sell now, secure a comfortable life for your wife somewhere less demanding before things get complicated. There is nothing complicated about it, Silas grated out. The land is not for sale. Sterling held his gaze for a long moment, his eyes cold and assessing. He nodded slowly. As you say, but check your deed. Silas, life is full of fine print. He tipped his hat again and climbed back into the buggy. As they drove away, Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Fine print. The way he had looked at her, as if he knew the secrets of their bedroom, as if he knew she was the weak link that would cost Silas everything. 2 days later, the humiliation came full circle. Silas had sent Clara into town with Jeb to pick up a replacement part for the windmill. While Jeb was at the smithy, Clara walked to the post office. She saw 2 men standing outside the saloon. One was Grimes, a heavy-set man who rode for the Double Bar S. He was laughing, a loud, braying sound. I am telling you, Grimes said to his companion, pitching his voice so it carried across the street. The old man bought a lemon. Sterling says the deed is as good as void if there is no issue, and there will not be any issue. The other man snickered. Why not? Silas is a bull of a man. Maybe, Grimes sneered. But the girl? I heard she freezes up like a scared rabbit. Or maybe she is not as fresh as she claimed. A woman who cannot bear a husband usually has sins hidden under her skirts. Damaged goods. That is what she is. Clara stopped dead in the middle of the street. The words struck her with the force of a physical slap. Damaged goods. Sins hidden under her skirts. They were talking about her body. They were laughing about her trauma. And they were saying that because of her, Silas would lose the ranch. She turned and practically ran back to the wagon, her face burning with a shame so hot it made her dizzy. She climbed onto the seat and sat there, trembling, staring at her hands. They were right. She was the poison in the well. She was the reason the wolves were circling. She did not tell Silas what she had heard. The shame was too deep. But that evening, a desperate resolve hardened inside her. She fed Silas supper, her movements jerky and frantic. She cleaned the kitchen until it sparkled. She was fighting for her life, fighting for his land. She had to fix this. She had to be a wife. The doctor had said to push through. Maybe she just hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe she was being weak. When they went to bed, the room was stiflingly hot. Silas sat on the edge of the mattress, unbuttoning his shirt. He looked tired. Clara stood before him. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. She reached out and touched his bare chest. Silas looked up, surprised. Clara, make love to me, she said. Her voice was brittle, high and tight. Do it now. Silas, please. She did not wait for his answer. She pushed him back onto the pillows and climbed over him. She was moving with a frantic, clumsy energy, her hands fumbling with his belt, her mouth pressing against his neck. Silas was stunned. He reached up to hold her waist. Clara, wait, slow down. No, waiting, she gasped. She was trembling violently, her eyes squeezed shut. Just do it. Just push through. It does not matter if it hurts. Just do it. She tried to guide him, her touch frantic, bordering on aggressive. But her body was screaming. Every muscle was locked in terror. She was hyperventilating, her breath coming in short, sobbing gasps. Silas felt her terror. It was radiating off her like heat. This wasn't desire, it was martyrdom. She was offering herself up like a sacrifice on an altar. He grabbed her wrists, stopping her hands. "Clara, stop! No!" she cried, struggling against his grip. "Do not stop! I have to do this! I have to!" She pulled free and tried to press herself against him again, but the contact sent a jolt of pure panic through her. Her body recoiled instinctively. "It hurts," she choked out, the cry involuntary. She shoved him away, scrambling back against the headboard, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with horror. She had failed. Again. Silas sat up, his chest heaving. The rejection, the confusion, the sheer madness of the moment snapped something inside him. He felt helpless. He felt like he was being tortured, tempted with water and then shown it was poison. He roared, a sound of pure, inarticulate frustration. He swung his fist and slammed it into the log wall beside the bed. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. Dust trickled down from the ceiling. A split appeared in the wood. Clara screamed and covered her head, curling into a ball. Silas froze. His knuckles were bleeding. The skin split. He looked at his hand, then at the woman cowering on the bed. He saw the absolute terror in her eyes. She thought he was going to hit her. She thought he had finally become the monster she feared. The realization hit him harder than the wall. He scrambled off the bed, stumbling back. "No," he rasped. "No, Clara, He could not speak. The fear that he could hurt her, that his anger was a wild animal he could not control, choked him. He turned and fled. He grabbed his boots and coat and ran out of the room, out of the house, into the dark, windy night. He did not return until dawn. The days that followed were a landscape of gray ash. The distance between them was no longer a gap. It was a chasm. They moved around each other like ghosts. Silas slept in the barn for 3 nights, telling her he needed to watch a sick mare. When he returned to the house, he slept on a pallet by the hearth. He could not bring himself to enter the bedroom. He could not face the look in her eyes. Clara moved through her chores with a dead mechanical efficiency. She felt hollowed out. She had tried to give him what he wanted, and it had ended in violence. She had driven him away. She saw his bandaged hand, the blood seeping through the linen, and guilt ate her alive. They spoke only of necessary things. Pass the salt. The wind is rising. The hens are laying. Silas was drowning in his own guilt. He had scared her. He had lost control. He felt he had undone months of patience in a single second of rage. He wanted to apologize, but the words felt too small for the damage he had done. And while they drifted in their sea of silence, the sharks began to circle. In the back room of the church, Hiram Sterling sat with Reverend Prynne and 2 of the town elders. The Reverend's face was grave. "It is a difficult matter, Brother Sterling," the Reverend said, "but the scriptures are clear, and they shall become one flesh. If there is no union, then there is no marriage," Sterling finished smoothly. "And if there is no marriage, the deed to the land, which specifies a transfer to Silas Thorne and his lawful heirs, is open to challenge." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We have a duty, Reverend, to the community, to the moral standing of the town. Can we truly allow a man to live in sin with a woman who is not, in the eyes of God or nature, his wife?" The Reverend pursed his lips and nodded slowly. "We cannot." Sterling smiled. He stood up and buttoned his coat. "Then I believe it is time we intervene. For the sake of the rancher's soul, of course." Outside, the wind hissed against the church walls, carrying the first whispers of the legal storm that was about to break over the silent, fractured house in the valley. The silence in the ranch house was not empty. It was crowded with ghosts. For days, Clara moved through her chores like a woman walking underwater, the weight of her history pressing against her chest. When she closed her eyes, she was not in Wyoming. She was back in the cramped, sour-smelling cabin in Ohio. She remembered the sound of her father's boots on the floorboards. Heavy and stumbling, he had been a man eaten hollow by failure and corn whiskey. A man who looked at his 4 daughters and saw only mouths to feed. Useless, he would roar, his face twisted red. Another girl, another burden. God is punishing me with useless women. Clara had learned to make herself small, to disappear into corners, to equate a man's raised voice with the threat of violence. But the fear that truly lived in her bones came later. It came on the Oregon Trail, 3 weeks out from Independence. There was a man named Miller, a drover with grease under his fingernails and eyes that seemed to strip the clothes from her body. One evening, while she was fetching water from the creek, he had cornered her against a cottonwood tree. There were no words, just the rough scrape of his canvas coat against her arm, the smell of chewing tobacco and unwashed skin. He had pressed his hips against hers, pinning her, his hand groping clumsily over her bodice. "Don't you scream," he had hissed. "You are just a stray. Nobody cares about a stray." She had frozen. Her mind had detached, floating above the scene, watching the girl by the creek. It was only when another traveler, an older woman named Mrs. Gable, no relation to the gossip in Bitter Creek, had come down the path singing a hymn that Miller had shoved Clara away and vanished into the dusk. Nothing had happened. Not really. He hadn't finished. But her body remembered the trap. It remembered the crushing weight, the helplessness, the sensation of being prey. That memory was a tripwire in her soul. Every time Silas moved too fast, every time his large frame blocked the light, the tripwire snapped, and she was that girl by the creek again, waiting to be devoured. Silas, too, was haunted. He spent his days riding the fence line, punishing himself with work until his muscles screamed, trying to outrun the shadow of the man he used to be. He remembered the war, the cold mud of Vicksburg, the way a bayonet felt when it hit bone. He had killed men, boys, really, in flurries of rage and desperation. He had learned that violence was a tool, efficient and final. But the ghost that terrified him most was Martha, his first wife. She had been small, like Clara, but fiery. They had argued once, over money, over his drinking in those dark days after the war. He had been tired, angry, the whiskey burning in his gut. She had shouted something, and he had grabbed her arm. Just grabbed her, but he had been strong, and he had been angry. He remembered the bruise on her arm the next day, 5 distinct fingerprints turning purple on her pale skin. He remembered the look in her eyes for a split second before she pulled away. Fear. She had been afraid of him. She died 6 months later in childbirth, taking their son with her. He never got to apologize for that bruise. He never got to erase that look of fear. It was the last true thing between them. Now, when he looked at his hand, the hand that had punched the wall, the hand that had split the wood, he saw a weapon. He saw the potential for destruction. He was terrified that the violence was not just a tool he had picked up, but a part of him, a rot in the wood of his soul. That was why he held back. That was why he slept on the floor. He was protecting Clara not just from his desire, but from his nature. Sunday came, bringing with it the obligation of appearance. They rode to church in silence. The wind was relentless, tearing at the buggy's cover. Reverend Prynne was in fine form. He stood in the pulpit, his voice booming, his eyes scanning the congregation until they rested, briefly but unmistakably, on Silas and Clara, in the third pew. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord," Prynne thundered. "For the husband is the head of the wife. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and a wife who withholds her duty is a wife who invites the serpent into the garden." He paused, letting the words hang in the stagnant air. "And a husband who cannot rule his own house," Prynne continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "is like a city broken down. And without walls, weakness in the head leads to rot in the body." The congregation shifted. Heads turned slightly. Whispers rustled like dry leaves. Clara felt the heat rise up her neck, staining her cheeks. She felt naked. They were talking about her. They were talking about her fear and calling it sin. Silas sat like a statue. His jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He stared straight ahead, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his hat. The ride home was excruciating. The words of the sermon echoed in the buggy. "Withholds her duty, cannot rule his house." When they reached the ranch, Clara went straight to the kitchen. She began to prepare supper, her movements frantic. She chopped potatoes with a knife that flashed in the dim light. The shame was a physical pressure in her chest, expanding until she couldn't breathe. Silas came in from the barn. He stood by the door, watching her. "Clara," he said quietly. The knife slipped. It nicked her finger. A drop of bright red blood welled up. Clara dropped the knife. It clattered onto the table. She stared at the blood, and then she broke. It was not a silent weeping this time. It was a keen of despair. She turned to the sink, gripping the edge of the basin, her shoulders shaking violently. "I cannot do it," she cried out, her voice raw. "I cannot be what they want. I cannot be what you want." Silas took a step forward. "Clara, don't!" she screamed, spinning around to face him. Her eyes were wild, her face wet with tears. You don't know what it's like." She was trembling so hard she could barely stand. "My father, he hated us. He hated that we were girls. He told me I was useless. And then, on the trail, that man," the words poured out of her, "a dam breaking. He cornered me by the creek. He put his hands on me. He smelled like tobacco and dirt, and he was so heavy. He told me I was a stray and no one would care." She sobbed, gasping for air. "I feel him every time you come close, every time it gets dark. I feel his hands. I feel like I am trapped against that tree and there is no one coming. It is not you, Silas! It is not you, but my body!" "My body thinks it is him." She slumped against the counter, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, her face buried in her apron. "I am sorry," she wailed. "I am so sorry. I am broken." Silas stood frozen. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of her weeping and the wind rattling the shutters. He felt as if he had been punched in the gut. "He cornered me. I feel his hands." The rage that flared in him was white-hot, rage at a nameless man on a wagon train. Rage at a father he would never meet. But beneath the rage was a profound, aching sorrow. He looked at the woman huddled on the floor. She wasn't rejecting him. She was terrified for her life. She was fighting a ghost every time he touched her. He walked slowly across the room. He did not rush. He did not want to startle her. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down, balancing on the balls of his feet. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough, thick with emotion. She did not look up. Silas reached out, but he stopped his hand inches from her shoulder. He waited. "Clara, look at me." Slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was swollen, her eyes red and swimming with tears. She looked like a child who expected to be struck. Silas swallowed hard. His own eyes were stinging. "Can I hold you?" he asked. He saw her flinch. Not like a husband," he said quickly. "Just, can I hold you, like someone who matters, like someone who is safe?" Clara looked at him. She saw the tears standing in his eyes. She saw the open, helpless look on his face. This was not the hard rancher. This was not the man who punched walls. She gave a tiny, jerky nod. Silas moved slowly. He sat on the floor beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into his chest. He did not press. He did not grasp. He created a shelter with his body and invited her in. Clara stiffened for a second, waiting for the trap to spring, but there was no trap. There was only the smell of wood smoke and soap and the steady, thumping rhythm of his heart. She let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed against him. She buried her face in his flannel shirt and cried, but the tears were different now. They were a release, a poison leaving the wound. Silas rested his chin on the top of her head. He rocked her slightly, back and forth. "He was wrong," Silas rumbled, his voice vibrating in his chest. "Your father was wrong. You are not useless. And that man, if I ever find a man like that," he took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I will never be that man. Clara, I swear to you, I would cut off my own hands before I made you feel like that." They sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, until the fire in the stove burned low and the room grew chill. "Come on," Silas said gently. "You need to rest." He helped her up. Her legs were shaky. They walked to the bedroom. That night, Silas did not blow out the lamp immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped between his knees. Clara sat against the headboard, watching him. "I have ghosts too." "Clara," he said, staring at the floor. He began to speak, his voice low and halting. He told her about Vicksburg. He told her about the smell of the field hospitals. He told her about the rage that lived in him, the black dog that rode on his back. And then he told her about Martha. I grabbed her. He whispered, "We were fighting. It was stupid. I was drunk." I grabbed her arm, and she looked at me. She looked at me the way you looked at me when I hit the wall, like I was a stranger, like I was a danger. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with shame. She died before I could fix it. I never got to tell her I was sorry. I never got to show her I could be gentle. He opened his hand, looking at the palm. "I am scared too. Clara, I am scared that I am violent. I am scared that if I let myself want you, if I let myself take what I want, I will hurt you, I will crush you, and I cannot survive that again." Clara watched him. She saw the vulnerability in his slumped shoulders. He was just as afraid of his own strength as she was. He wasn't a monster. He was a man terrified of becoming one. Something shifted in her chest. The fear was still there, but the isolation was gone. They were two wounded people in a dark room, trying to keep from drowning. She moved on the bed. The mattress creaked. She reached out and touched his arm. "Silas?" she said softly. He looked at her. "Can we?" She hesitated, searching for the words. "Can we just try to be close? Without the rest? Without going all the way? Just be together?" Silas looked at her hand on his arm. It was a lifeline. "You mean, just lie there?" "Yes, just lie there. But close." Silas nodded. "I would like that." He blew out the lamp. He climbed into the bed, but this time he did not turn away. He lay on his side, facing her. Clara moved closer. Her heart was hammering, but she forced herself to breathe. "He is safe. He is safe." She moved until her forehead was resting against his chest. She could feel the heat of him through his shirt. Silas lay perfectly still. He did not move his hands. He let her set the distance, slowly. Clara reached out and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Can you hold me?" she whispered. Silas brought his arm up. He moved with agonizing slowness, giving her 1,000 chances to pull away. When his arm settled over her waist, it was light, barely a weight at all. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a month. They lay there in the dark, the wind howling outside. Silas moved his thumb, tracing small circles on her back. It was a hypnotic, soothing rhythm. "Is this all right?" he murmured. "Yes," she whispered. He moved his other hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His fingers were rough, calloused from the reins and the shovel, but his touch was feather-light. He traced the line of her cheekbone, the curve of her jaw. Clara closed her eyes. She focused on the sensation. It was not grasping. It was reverent. He was touching her face as if he were blind and trying to memorize her features. Hours passed. The moon rose high, painting the room in silver. They did not sleep. They explored the territory of each other's presence. Silas unbuttoned his cuff and let her trace the scar on his wrist. She let him hold her hand, interlacing their fingers, marveling at the size difference. He pulled her closer, just an inch. She stiffened for a second, then relaxed. He stopped. He waited. "Okay?" he asked. "Okay," she said. The desire was there. It was a hum in the air, a warmth in the blood. Silas felt the ache of it, heavy and insistent. He wanted to pull her against him, to bury himself in her warmth. But he wrapped that desire in layers of tenderness. He made it wait. He made it serve her safety. Clara felt the change in herself. The panic that usually sat on her chest like a stone began to dissolve in his arms, with his breath steady against her hair. She didn't feel like prey. She felt like a treasure. She felt cherished. Sometime near dawn, she shifted. She moved her leg, her knee brushing against his thigh. She did not pull back. She pressed closer, seeking his warmth. Silas kissed her forehead, then her temple, then, very gently, her cheek. She turned her face toward him. Their lips met. It was not a passionate, devouring kiss. It was a question. Are you there? Am I safe? It was chaste, but it shook them both. Clara pulled back slightly, looking at him in the gray light of pre-dawn. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas felt a lump in his throat. She hadn't said, "I'm sorry." She hadn't apologized for her fear. She had thanked him for his patience. He pulled the quilt up around her shoulders. "Sleep now, Clara." "I am right here." He held her while she slept, watching the sun come up over the broken land. He was exhausted, his body aching with unfulfilled need, but his heart felt lighter than it had in 10 years. He had not taken, he had been given, and that made all the difference. When Clara woke, Silas was already gone. She sat up, feeling a strange sense of calm. The dread that usually greeted the morning was absent. She walked out to the kitchen. The coffee was hot. She went to the door and looked out at her garden. Her hand flew to her mouth. During the night, a late frost had struck. The hard freeze had turned her young bean plants black. The turnips were wilted, their leaves crusted with rime. Her garden, the one thing she had fought the earth for, was dead. She stepped off the porch, her shoes crunching on the frozen grass. She knelt by the bean row. She touched a blackened leaf. It crumbled in her fingers. Sorrow washed over her, sharp and biting. All that work, all that hope, gone in a single cold night. But as she knelt there, grieving her lost plants, she realized something. She was not afraid of the failure. The land was cruel. Yes, the frost killed. But inside the house, there was warmth. Inside, there was a man who had held her all night and never asked for more than she could give. She looked toward the barn where Silas was working. She could hear the ring of a hammer. The garden was dead, but something else, something much harder to grow, had finally taken root. The sheriff arrived on a Tuesday, riding a bay gelding that looked as tired as the man in the saddle. Sheriff Miller was a decent man, worn smooth by the friction of trying to keep law in a lawless land. But when he handed Silas the envelope, he would not meet the rancher's eyes. "It is a writ of inquiry, Silas," the sheriff said, adjusting his hat to block the glare. "Filed this morning at the county clerk's office. Hiram Sterling is pushing it, along with the church elders." Silas stood on the porch, his thumb hooking the belt of his trousers. He did not open the envelope. He knew what it contained. "On what grounds?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of a subterranean rock shift. "Fraudulent contract," the sheriff muttered. They are saying the terms of the deed require a legitimate heir, or the prospect of one, and they are saying that since the marriage has not been naturalized, it is effectively void. They are calling for an annulment and a reversion of the title." Clara was standing in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She heard every word. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale as a winter moon. It was not just shame that washed over her this time. It was a cold, clarifying shock. She walked out onto the porch. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced them to move. "They are trying to take the ranch because of me," she said. It was not a question. Sheriff Miller tipped his hat, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Thorne, it is a legal maneuver. Sterling wants the water rights. He is using whatever lever he can find." Clara looked at the envelope in Silas's hand. She saw the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped it. For months, she had blamed herself. She had carried the weight of her trauma like a stone around her neck, believing her fear was a personal failure, a weakness of character. But now, she saw the machinery behind the curtain. It was not just about her body. It was about power. It was the same story she had known all her life. Her father screaming about useless mouths. The man on the wagon train taking what he wanted because he was strong and she was weak. And now, a rich man in a silk vest using her private pain to steal her husband's land. A spark ignited in her chest. It was small, buried under layers of ash and fear. But it was hot. It was fury. "They are using my pain as a weapon," she whispered. Silas looked at her. He expected to see her crumble. He expected the tears that usually followed any mention of their intimacy. But her eyes were dry. They were wide and dark, burning with a sudden, fierce realization. He crumpled the envelope in his fist. "Let them try," Silas said. "I will hold this land against hell and high water, and I will hold it against Hiram Sterling." But hell came to them first. It happened 3 nights later. The wind had died down, leaving the valley in a rare, breathless silence. The moon was obscured by a veil of high clouds. Silas and Clara had gone to bed early, lying side by side in the dark, their hands clasped between them, the new, quiet ritual that anchored them both. Clara woke to the sound of screaming. It was not a human scream. It was the high, terrifying shriek of a horse in panic. Silas was already moving. He threw the quilt back, grabbing his trousers and his boots. "Fire!" he roared. Clara scrambled up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked out the window. The night was no longer black. It was a pulsating, angry orange. The barn was burning. They ran out into the yard, the heat hitting them like a physical wall. The dry timber of the old barn had caught like kindling. Flames licked up the side of the structure, curling toward the roof where the winter hay was stored. If the hay caught, the whole building would be an inferno in minutes. "The horses!" Clara screamed. Jeb and the other hand, a quiet boy named Toby, were already there, shirtless and soot-streaked, trying to kick open the corral gate to let the panicked animals loose. Silas did not stop for buckets. He ran straight into the smoke-filled barn. "Silas!" Clara shrieked, terror gripping her throat. She grabbed a burlap sack from the porch, dipped it in the horse trough until it was sodden, and ran toward the flames. The heat seared her face. The air tasted of burning pine and horsehair. She saw Silas emerge from the smoke, leading a terrified mare by the halter, his coat thrown over the animal's head. He shoved the horse toward the open pasture and turned back. "The roof!" Jeb shouted. "The roof is going!" Sparks showered down like deadly rain. The sound was deafening. The roar of the fire, the crack of splitting timber, the distant, frantic howling of coyotes answering the chaos. "We need water on the north wall," Silas yelled, his voice raw, "or it will jump to the house." For an hour, they fought the beast. It was a battle of muscles and will against the elemental hunger of the fire. Clara hauled buckets until her arms screamed, sloshing water onto the smoking logs of the house, stamping out sparks that landed in the dry grass with her boots. Her dress was soaked and ruined, her face blackened with soot, but she did not stop. She worked with a savage intensity, defending the only home she had ever known. Finally, the roof of the barn collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending a geyser of sparks into the black sky. But the walls held, and the wind did not rise. The fire, having consumed its fuel, began to sulk and die down. Silas stood by the water trough, heaving for breath. He wiped his face with a rag, leaving streaks of mud on his skin. He looked at the ruin of his barn, then out toward the darkness of the ridge. The fire had started on the side away from the house, where there was no lantern, no stove. It was not an accident. Movement caught his eye, a shadow detaching itself from the brush on the hill, slipping away toward the road. Silas went still. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He recognized the shape. He recognized the limp of the rider trying to mount a horse in the shadows. It was a man he had seen riding for the Double Bar S. Silas turned and grabbed his Winchester rifle from where it leaned against the porch rail. "Silas?" Clara called out, her voice trembling with exhaustion. He did not answer. He levered around into the chamber with a metallic clack-clack that cut through the crackle of the dying flames. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the rage that had been simmering in him for months, the rage at the gossip, at the doctor, at his own helplessness, at the world that wanted to crush his wife, boiled over. He had the man in his sights. It was a long shot. But Silas Thorne did not miss. He was going to kill him. He was going to kill the man who tried to burn them out. He wanted blood. He wanted to end the threat permanently. His finger tightened on the trigger. The red mist descended, narrowing his vision to the small V of the iron sight. "Silas!" The voice cut through the roar in his head. It was not a scream. It was a command. Clara was beside him. She did not grab the gun. She put her hand on his arm, her soot-stained fingers pressing into his tense muscle. "Silas, look at me!" He did not look. He kept the rifle shouldered. "He burned our barn." "Clara, I know," she said, her voice steady despite the smoke in her lungs. "I know he did. But if you pull that trigger, you are not protecting us. You are destroying us." Silas's breath hissed through his teeth. "He deserves it." "Maybe," Clara said, "but you are not a murderer. Silas, you told me you would never be the man who kills in rage again. Do not let them make you into that man. Do not let Sterling turn you into a killer. That is what he wants. He wants you to hang." The words pierced the red haze. "He wants you to hang. If he killed the man, the law would descend. Sterling would have his excuse. The ranch would be gone. Clara would be alone." Silas trembled. The war inside him was more violent than the fire. He wanted to take the life. He wanted justice. "Silas, please," Clara whispered. "Come back to me. Slowly, agonizingly." Silas lowered the barrel. He exhaled, a shuddering sound that came from the bottom of his soul. He watched the shadow on the ridge disappear into the night. He turned to look at his wife. She was unrecognizable, hair wild, face black with soot, dress torn, but her eyes were clear and fierce. She had saved him. He dropped the rifle into the dirt and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her smoky hair. He choked out. "I know," she said, holding him tight. "I know." The next morning, the smell of wet ash hung heavy over the valley. Sheriff Miller rode out again, looking at the charred remains of the barn. He walked the perimeter, finding the distinct tracks of a shod horse near the origin point of the fire. He found the remnants of a kerosene rag. It was arson, Miller said, spitting into the dust. No doubt about it. It was one of Sterling's men. Silas said flatly. "I saw him." "Can you prove it?" Miller asked. "Did you see his face?" "I saw enough." "That is not proof. Silas, not in a court. And certainly not in a town where the judge owes the bank money." The sheriff sighed, looking tired. "If you go after him with a gun, you lose everything. Sterling is counting on you losing your temper. He wants you to act the brute." "So what do we do?" Clara asked. She was sitting on the porch step, cleaning the soot from a lantern. "Do we just let him burn us down?" "No," Miller said. "You fight him where he feels safe. The church council is meeting tomorrow night to discuss the validity of your union. Sterling will be there. He expects you to be cowed. He expects you to be ashamed." He looked at Clara. "He expects you to be silent. Mrs. Thorne." The church was stiflingly hot. Every pew was packed. It seemed the entire population of Bitter Creek had turned out for the spectacle. The air smelled of bodies, wool, and the sharp tang of anticipation. Silas and Clara sat in the front pew on the left. They sat a foot apart, not touching, but their posture mirrored each other, spines straight, heads up. Across the aisle sat Hiram Sterling. He looked cool and composed in a gray suit, flanked by a man Silas recognized as a lawyer from Cheyenne, a man with a face like a ferret. Reverend Prynne stood at the pulpit. He looked grave, burdened by the weight of his self-imposed righteousness. "We are gathered to address a matter of spiritual and legal import," Prynne began. "The sanctity of marriage is the bedrock of our community. When that sanctity is mocked, when a contract is made in bad faith, it is the duty of the elders to investigate." He nodded to the lawyer. The lawyer stood up. He did not look at Silas. He looked at the crowd, playing to the gallery. "Mr. Thorne," the lawyer began, his voice oily. "You entered into a contract of marriage with this woman 3 months ago. Is that correct?" "It is," Silas said, not standing up. "And the purpose of this marriage, as stated in the deed of trust for your land, involves the production of heirs." "The purpose of the marriage was to take a wife," Silas said. The lawyer smiled thinly. A semantic distinction. But let us be direct. Has this marriage been consummated? Have you, Silas Thorne, known this woman in the biblical sense? The room went deadly silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Silas stared at the lawyer. He felt the anger uncoiling in his gut, but he remembered Clara's hand on his arm in the smoke. He remembered the rifle in the dirt. "That is a private matter," Silas said. "It is a public matter when the title of the land depends on it," the lawyer snapped. "If you have not bedded her, there is no marriage. It is a fraud, a sham to keep the bank from its due. So answer the question. Is she your wife, or is she merely a squatter in your house? Is she physically capable of her duties, or is she defective?" The word hung in the air. "Defective?" Silas's hands clenched into fists on his knees. He started to rise, his face darkening with blood. "Sit down, Silas." The voice was soft, but it carried to the back of the room. Clara stood up. She was wearing her best dress, the gray one she had been married in, though now it was clean and pressed. She looked small against the vast backdrop of the rough-hewn cross, but she did not look down. She looked at the lawyer. Then she looked at Sterling. Then she turned and looked at the faces of the townspeople. Mrs. Gable, the smithy, the women who had whispered about her in the store. "I will answer," Clara said. A ripple of shock went through the room. Women did not speak in council. Certainly not women who were the subject of such scandalous inquiry. Clara's heart was beating so fast she thought she might faint. Her knees shook under her petticoats. But she remembered the feeling of the heat on her face when she ran into the burning barn. She remembered the feeling of Silas's heartbeat when he held her on the floor. "My husband has not bedded me," Clara said. Her voice wavered, then strengthened. "Not yet." Gasps, murmurs. Sterling smirked, leaning back in his pew. "Because I asked him not to," Clara continued. She took a step toward the center of the aisle. "I came here from a hard life. I came here with scars that you cannot see, but that are as real as the brand on a steer. I was hurt by men. I was taught that a man's hands are only for taking, only for hurting." She looked directly at Mrs. Gable. "You whisper that I am cold. You whisper that I am broken. You say I have sins under my skirts." She paused. "I have fear under my skirts. That is my sin. I was terrified. When I came to this house, I flinched every time my husband moved. I waited for the blow. I waited to be used and discarded." She turned to look at Silas. He was watching her with an expression of such intense pride and love that it gave her the strength to continue. "But this man who you say is committing a fraud, he did not force me. He could have. The law says he has the right. The doctor told him to push through my fear, but he did not." She looked back at the crowd. "He waited. He slept on the floor. He held me when I cried. He chose to be gentle when he had every right to be hard. You ask if he is a husband. He saved my life in a blizzard. He saved our animals from a fire while you slept in your beds. He has healed me, not by taking, but by giving." Her voice rang out now, clear and bell-like in the hushed church. "We are building a marriage. It is not finished yet, but it is real. It is more real than a contract signed in ink. It is built on trust, and that is not something for you to inspect. That belongs to us." She stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. Sterling's lawyer cleared his throat, looking flustered. "A touching speech, madam, but legally. Legally, you are on shaky ground. Counselor." Sheriff Miller stood up from the back pew. He walked heavily down the aisle, his spurs clinking. "I found kerosene rags at the barn," Miller said, looking directly at Sterling. "And I found tracks that match a horse I saw tied up at the Double Bar S bunkhouse this morning." Sterling's smirk vanished. "That is slander." "Sheriff, it is an investigation," Miller corrected. "And it seems mighty convenient that a fire starts at the exact moment you are trying to force a sale." Miller turned to the Reverend and the elders. "You want to annul a marriage because a man is treating his wife with decency. You want to hand this land over to a man who might have hired an arsonist? Is that the justice of this church?" The Reverend looked at Sterling, then at Silas, then at the women in the congregation. He saw the faces of the women. They were not looking at Clara with judgment anymore. They were looking at her with recognition. They knew the hardness of life. They knew what it meant to be at the mercy of men, and they saw, in Silas Thorne, something they rarely saw, a man who put a woman's soul above his own rights. There was a murmur of assent from the pews. "He is a good man," a woman's voice called out. It was the blacksmith's wife. "Let them be," shouted a ranch hand near the door. The Reverend cleared his throat. He looked down at his papers. He looked at Sterling, who was now pale and tight-lipped. The council finds no grounds for annulment," the Reverend said, his voice quiet. "The marriage stands. What passes between a man and wife is, indeed, private." Sterling stood up abruptly. He glared at Silas, then at Clara. "This is not over," he hissed. "It is for today." "Hiram," Silas said, "not rising." Sterling turned and marched out of the church, his lawyer scrambling after him. The hearing dissolved into chaos. People stood up. The tension broke. Clara felt her legs give way. She swayed, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush. Silas was there instantly. He caught her before she fell. He wrapped his large coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the stairs. Though the stairs were no longer hostile, he leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "I have never been prouder," he whispered. "Not in my whole life. You were magnificent." Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining. We won," Silas said. They walked out of the church together, into the bright, blinding sunlight. The wind caught Clara's skirts, but she did not fight it. She leaned into Silas, feeling the solid warmth of his side against hers. The town of Bitter Creek went on with its business. The dust devils spun, the mountains loomed. But as they walked toward their wagon, Clara knew that the town no longer held any power over her. She had spoken her shame aloud, and it had evaporated in the light. She looked at Silas. He was smiling, a real, broad smile that showed the lines around his eyes. "Let us go home," he said. "Yes," Clara answered. "Let us go home." They climbed into the wagon, leaving the whispers and the judgments behind them in the dust, turning their faces toward the open range and the future that was finally, truly theirs. Summer arrived not with a gentle warming, but with the force of an anvil's strike. The high plains of Wyoming turned into a crucible of heat and light. By July of 1879, the sun was a white-hot coin pressed against the sky, bleaching the color from the sagebrush and turning the earth into iron. The wind did not stop, but it changed. It became a dry, rasping breath that sucked the moisture from the skin and carried clouds of alkali dust that coated everything in a fine, gray powder. It was weather that broke weaker spirits, sending homesteaders packing back to the green, humid valleys of the east. But on the Thorne Ranch, the heat did not break them. It forged them. The barn, half destroyed by the arsonist's fire, had to be rebuilt before the autumn rains. It was brutal, back-breaking work. Silas felled timber in the high gullies, hauling the logs down with a team of heavy draft horses. Clara, her hands now calloused and brown from the sun, did not stay in the house. She worked beside him. She learned to strip the bark from the pine logs with a draw knife, the muscles in her arms hardening. She learned to mix the mud chinking to seal the gaps, working it into the cracks until her fingers were stiff. They worked in a rhythm born of necessity. There was little talk during the day. The heat made words too expensive, but there was a constant, silent communication. Silas would pause to wipe the sweat from his eyes and find Clara already there with a dipper of cool water from the well. Clara would struggle with the weight of a beam, and Silas's hands would appear instantly to take the burden, not pushing her aside, but lifting with her. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a house. They were a team sharing a survival. The town of Bitter Creek watched this transformation with a wary respect. The hearing in the church had shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The story of Clara's speech, of her standing up to Hiram Sterling, had rippled through the community. The gossip did not vanish. Towns like Bitter Creek fed on rumors like cattle fed on grass, but the flavor of it changed. It was no longer malicious. It was curious. One blistering Tuesday, Clara rode the wagon into town for nails and flour. She braced herself for the usual cold shoulders, lifting her chin high as she walked up the steps of the general store. Mrs. Higgins, the blacksmith's wife, a woman who had previously looked through Clara as if she were made of glass, was at the counter. She turned as Clara entered. "Hot day for a ride, Mrs." Higgins said. Clara paused, her hand on the doorframe. "It is," she replied cautiously. "The dust is fierce, Mrs." Higgins nodded. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small, folded paper packet. "My hollyhocks did well this year, Mrs." Higgins said, holding out the packet. "Too many seeds for my patch. I thought maybe you could use them for that garden of yours. I hear the frost took your beans." Clara stared at the seeds. It was a peace offering. It was an acknowledgement that she was staying, that she was a woman who planted gardens in the dust, just like them. "Thank you," Clara said, taking the packet. Her throat felt tight. "I will plant them by the porch, Mrs." Higgins smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "They like the morning sun. You tell that husband of yours the smithy has those hinges ready." Outside the store, another change awaited. Toby, the young ranch hand who had helped fight the fire, was loading the sacks of flour into Clara's wagon. When she moved to pay him a coin for his trouble, he shook his head. "No, ma'am," Toby said, tipping his hat. "The boss, Mr. Thorne. He paid my wages when I was laid up with that broken foot last winter. He did not have to. I reckon I owe the brand some extra work. You just get that barn built." Clara drove home with the seeds in her pocket, feeling a strange lightness in her chest. The isolation was cracking. They were weaving themselves into the fabric of the place, not by bending to its rules, but by enduring its tests. The evenings became their sanctuary. When the sun finally dipped below the western ridges, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange, the heat would lift, leaving the air sweet with a scent of cooling sage. They sat on the porch, Silas in his rocking chair, Clara on the steps, leaning against the post. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken fears. It was the companionable silence of two people who had sweated into the same earth all day. Slowly, haltingly, they began to learn the language of each other's hearts. They talked about things that had been too dangerous to touch before. "Tell me about the war," Clara asked one night, watching the fireflies dance over the creek. "Not the fighting, the other parts." Silas rocked slowly. "The coffee tasted bad," he said, his voice low. It tasted like mud and chicory. "But the letters. Getting a letter was like holding a piece of sunlight. I used to keep a letter from my brother in my pocket for 6 months. Just the paper felt like home." He paused. "I think that is why I wanted this place to be strong. I wanted a place that could not be blown away. A place where, if you put something in your pocket, it stayed there." Clara nodded. "I never had a pocket," she said softly. "My dresses were hand-me-downs from my sisters. Nothing was ever mine. Even my name felt like it was borrowed." She looked at him. "When you gave me the ring, it was the first thing I ever owned that was just for me, even if I was too scared to wear it properly." Silas stopped rocking. He looked at her in the dim light. "You wear it properly now. Clara, you wear it better than anyone I know." They talked about fear, too, not the paralyzing terror of the past, but the small, daily fears. Silas admitted he was afraid of becoming old and useless, of the day he could not lift a saddle. Clara admitted she was afraid of thunder, of the way it sounded like God was angry. And they talked about desire. It started cautiously. Silas told her how he loved to watch her brush her hair in the lamplight, how the copper shine of it made his chest ache. Clara told him, blushing in the dark, that she liked the way his forearms looked when he rolled up his sleeves to chop wood, strong and capable. These confessions were bricks. laying a foundation of safety. They were taking the mystery out of the physical, turning it from a monster into a conversation. August came, hot and gold. The barn was finished, the roof smelling of fresh pine tar. One night, after a long day of moving cattle to the upper pasture, they bathed separately in the kitchen, washing the dust from their skin. The house was quiet. The wind was a low murmur against the eaves. Clara stood in the bedroom, wearing her white nightgown. She felt a difference in her body tonight. The exhaustion was there, yes, but beneath it was a hum, a warmth that had been growing for weeks. She thought of Silas lifting the beams. She thought of him holding her through the nightmares. She thought of the way he looked at her on the porch, with a hunger that he kept on a leash for her sake. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that the leash was no longer necessary. The fear was still a memory, a scar on her mind, but it was no longer a wall. She trusted him. She trusted him with her life. It was time to trust him with the rest. Silas came into the room. He was wearing clean trousers and a fresh shirt, his hair damp from washing. He moved to blow out the lamp. "Leave it," Clara said. Silas froze, his hand near the glass chimney. He turned to look at her. "Clara, I want to see you," she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "And I want you to see me." She took a step toward him. "I want to try again. Silas, tonight." Silas looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw the nerves, the tremor in her hands, but he also saw the resolve. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "We can wait. There is no hurry. I am sure," she said. "But we have to go slow. You have to let me lead. And if I say stop—" "Then we stop," Silas said instantly. "The moment you say the word, or even if you just look like you want to stop, I promise." He stood perfectly still, letting her cross the distance between them. Clara stopped in front of him. She reached out and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. Her fingers brushed the skin of his chest. He was warm, radiating a solid, living heat. She looked up at him. He was holding his breath. His hands were at his sides, open, showing her he would not grab, he would not take. She took his hands and placed them on her waist. "Hold me," she whispered. Silas's hands settled on her hips. They were heavy and large, but his touch was reverent. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer. Clara closed her eyes. She waited for the panic. She waited for the memory of the man on the trail to rise up and choke her. It came, a flicker of shadow. But then she smelled the soap on Silas's skin. She felt the calluses on his thumbs rubbing soothing circles on her waist. She heard his breathing, ragged and controlled. "This is Silas," she told herself. "This is the man who saved the calf. This is the man who slept on the floor." The shadow receded. She stepped closer, pressing her body against his. The contact was electric. She felt him shudder. "Kiss me," she said. He lowered his head. He kissed her, not with the chaste dryness of the morning peck, but with a deep, suppressed intensity. His mouth was warm and soft. Clara opened to him, a little at first, then more. They moved to the bed. It was not a scene of sweeping romance. It was a scene of negotiation and profound care. Silas let her set the pace. Every time he moved, he checked her eyes. "Is this okay? Is this too much?" At one point, as they lay tangling together on the quilt, his weight shifted over her, and the old terror spiked. Clara gasped, her body stiffening. "Wait," she choked out. Silas stopped instantly. He froze, supporting his weight on his elbows, hovering above her but not pressing down. "I am here," he whispered. "I am not going anywhere. Look at me, Clara." She looked at him. His face was flushed with desire, but his eyes were kind. He was not lost in the moment. He was right there with her. "I am okay," she breathed, the panic ebbing away like a tide. "I am okay." She reached up and pulled him down. When the moment of full union finally came, it was not a conquest. It was a gift. It was Clara choosing, finally and completely, to let the walls fall. It hurt, a sharp, brief pain that made her cry out, but then it was replaced by a feeling of fullness, of completion. Silas held her as if she were the most precious thing in the territory. He murmured to her the whole time, words of praise, words of love, words that anchored her to the present. "You are so brave," he whispered against her neck. "You are so beautiful." When it was over, Clara did not turn away. She did not cry with shame. She cried with relief. The tears ran down her temples into her hair. Silas kissed them away. "Thank you," she whispered, echoing the words she had said months ago, but with a completely different weight. Silas wrapped the quilt around them, pulling her back against his chest. They lay in the golden glow of the dying lamp, listening to the wind outside. It sounded different tonight. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a song. They fell asleep like that, limbs tangled, the barrier between them burned away by trust. In the weeks that followed, the world did not magically become easy. The West did not trade its thorns for petals just because two people had found love. A week after the barn was finished, one of their best horses stepped in a gopher hole and broke its leg. Silas had to shoot it. He came back to the house gray-faced and silent, grieving the animal. Clara did not say a word. She simply made him coffee and sat with him on the porch, holding his hand until the grief settled into something bearable. Storms rolled in from the north, threatening to flatten the late-season hay. They spent 3 days and nights covering the stacks with canvas, fighting the wind until their fingers were raw. Hiram Sterling did not disappear. He still owned the bank. He still controlled the water rights further down the valley. He would occasionally ride past their fence line, sitting high on his horse, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. But he did not approach. He saw the way they worked together. He saw the way the town had rallied. And he saw the way Silas Thorne looked at his wife, like a man who would burn the world down before he let anyone touch her. Sterling was a businessman. He knew a bad investment when he saw one. He turned his horse and rode away. September brought a cooling of the air and a subtle shift in Clara. She began to feel a strangeness in the mornings, a dizziness that hit her when she first stood up, a distaste for the smell of frying bacon. She found herself napping in the afternoons, a fatigue settling deep in her bones that felt different from the tiredness of work. One evening, by the fire, Silas watched her sewing. She was working on a piece of white flannel, her stitches tiny and precise. "What are you making?" he asked, looking up from his ledger. Clara smiled, a secret, inward smile that lit her face. She held up the garment. It was too small for him. It was too small for her. It was a shirt for a creature the size of a doll. Silas went very still. He put the pen down. Ink blotted on the page, but he did not notice. "Clara," he said, his voice cracking. "I think," she said, smoothing the flannel over her knee, "I think we are going to need more wood for the cradle." Silas stood up. He crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees beside her chair. He put his large, scarred hand on the flannel, over her stomach. "Are you sure?" "I am not sure," she said, "but my mother used to say she knew before the calendar did, and I feel different. I feel full." Silas buried his face in her lap. His shoulders shook. He was weeping, silent, grateful tears. He had thought this part of his life was over. He had thought the name Thorne would end with him. "We will be good parents," Clara whispered, stroking his graying hair. "We will be gentle," Silas said, lifting his head. His eyes were fierce. "I will never raise my voice to him, or her. I will never make them feel small. And we will teach them that they are not useless," Clara said. "We will teach them that they belong here." October came with a final, violent storm. The last tantrum of the changing season before the snows of winter would settle in. It rained for 2 days, a deluge that turned the creek into a torrent and soaked the thirsty earth deep down to the roots. On the evening of the 2nd day, the rain stopped. Silas and Clara walked out onto the porch. The air was washed clean, sharp and cold and smelling of wet pine and damp earth. The clouds were breaking up in the west, revealing a sky of deep, infinite indigo. Lightning flashed far off over the distant hills, a silent display of power that felt like a salute rather than a threat. Clara leaned back against Silas's chest. He wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hands clasped protectively over the slight swell of her belly. She looked out at the land. It was still harsh. The sagebrush was still thorny. The wolves were still out there in the dark. It was a hard place to live, but she was no longer afraid of it. "Look at the stars," Silas said softly. Above them, the clouds parted fully, revealing a river of stars, the Milky Way stretching across the heavens in a band of diamond dust. It was vast and indifferent, but it was also beautiful. Clara took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean air. "It is going to be a cold winter," she said. "Let it come," Silas answered, pulling her tighter. "We have plenty of wood, and we have each other." Clara turned in his arms to look at him. His face was lined and weathered, marked by the years and the sun, but his eyes were clear. He was her husband. He was her safe harbor. "I love you, Silas," she whispered. It was the first time she had said the words aloud. Silas smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through the storm. "I love you, Clara, more than the land, more than the breath in my lungs." They stood there for a long time, watching the storm fade into the east. Two small figures against the immense backdrop of the American West. They had walked through fire and ice, through shame and silence, to find this moment of quiet grace. The wind blew gently across the porch, rocking the empty chair, whispering through the new shoots of the hollyhocks that were sleeping in the soil, waiting for spring. It was a wild, untamed land. But in this house, on this night, there was peace. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Silas and Clara touched your heart as much as it did mine to write it. It is a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, tenderness can survive. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. Thank you for spending this time with me.